The metal doors of the shelter clanged shut behind her wheelchair, the echo bouncing like a warning. The air was heavy with the mix of disinfectant and wet fur, the sound of restless paws scratching against iron bars. Every dog barked, whined or howled, except for one. At the far corner of the row, where shadows seemed to cling longer, a pair of burning amber eyes stared out unblinking, daring anyone to come closer. His growl was low, constant, vibrating against the cage like a storm bottled up too long. Most visitors hurried past that kennel. Staff had warned her before she came. That one's too far gone, too dangerous. Best not to stop. But the girl, her hands trembling slightly on the rubber rims of her chair, didn't move past. She couldn't. Something in the way those eyes flickered, rage tangled with pain, defiance softened by something unnamed, held her frozen in place. She was paralyzed from the waist down. He was paralyzed by fear and anger. And in that fragile, impossible moment, their brokenness reached for each other. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The shelter smelled of bleach and wet concrete, of damp fur and hopelessness. The girl hated that smell, though she couldn't quite say why. It clung to her the way pity often did. Thick, heavy, impossible to wash away. Her wheelchair hummed softly as she pushed it forward, rubber wheels rolling over tiny cracks in the floor. Around her, the kennels exploded with noisy, frantic barks, high-pitched whines, the desperate chorus of animals begging for attention, for freedom, for love. She tried to keep her breathing steady, though the chaos pressed in like a storm. She told herself she was only visiting, only volunteering for an afternoon, only watching. And yet, deep inside, she knew she was searching for something, though she couldn't name what. Then she heard it. Not a bark, not a whine, but the guttural sound of a growl so deep it rattled through her bones. Her head turned, and her gaze locked on the far corner of the room. There, behind thick metal bars, a dog stood rigid, muscles coiled like springs ready to snap. His fur was dark, mottled with scars, his teeth bared in a constant snarl. His amber eyes pierced straight into her as though he had been waiting for her. The staff had warned her before. Don't go near that one. He's dangerous. He's unadoptable. Honestly, he should have been put down months ago. Their words floated back now, mingling with the low, vibrating thunder of his growl. And yet she didn't move. Her chest tightened, but her hands gripped the wheels of her chair and held her there, rooted in the shadow of his rage. Every other visitor hurried past his kennel, some flinching at the sheer force of his presence. He lunged once at the bars, a violent flash of muscle and teeth, and a gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it. But when the echo of the lunge faded, she noticed something most people missed. For just half a second, in the flicker of his eyes, the rage had faltered. Something else had shown through fear. It was gone as quickly as it came, swallowed by another guttural snarl. But she had seen it, and she couldn't unsee it. Her throat went dry, the memory of her own hospital bed rushing back. Sterile white walls, the words of doctors weighing heavy. You may never walk again. She remembered the pitying eyes of strangers, the way people saw only her chair and not the girl inside it. They thought she was broken, useless, dangerous even to herself. Was that what this dog felt too? Misunderstood, mislabeled, discarded. Her hand trembled as she lifted it slowly, carefully, not touching the bars, only placing it near. The growl deepened, vibrating in the air between them. A volunteer rushed toward her. "Miss, please, don't." "He bites. He's not safe." But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on the dog's, her breathing shallow, her chest aching. She whispered, so soft she wasn't sure even he could hear. "It's okay, I know what it feels like." For a long, unbearable moment, nothing changed. He was still thunder bottle behind iron. She was still the girl in the chair, fragile and stubborn. And yet, as the seconds passed, the impossible happened. His growl broke. Not fully, not into silence, but it faltered, like a storm cloud letting in a sliver of light. He turned away first, pacing in the back of his kennel, restless, conflicted. The volunteer sighed with relief and pulled her chair gently back. "Please, don't waste your time. Dogs like him, they don't change." But as the girl let herself be wheeled away, her eyes stayed fixed on that shadowed corner, on the dog who everyone had given up on. She thought of the way people once spoke about her. in whispers when they thought she couldn't hear. She won't get better. She won't have a normal life. The words had burned then. They still burn now. And in that fire, she made a quiet promise. Not to the staff, not even to herself, but to the trembling soul hiding inside that cage of fury. I won't give up on you. The storm wasn't over. If anything, it had only begun. The next morning, the girl woke with the image of those amber eyes still burning in her chest. She tried to push it away, telling herself there were dozens of other dogs. Friendlier, gentler, easier. Dogs who wagged their tails when visitors came. Dogs who licked fingers pressed to the bars. Dogs who were ready for love. But none of their faces stayed with her the way his did. The growl, the scars, the brief flash of fear beneath the fury. It was as if he had lodged himself in the hollow spaces of her mind, refusing to leave. By afternoon, she found herself back at the shelter. The volunteers gave her wary glances when her wheels hummed over the cracked floor again. They didn't stop her this time, though. Perhaps they thought she would get bored. Perhaps they believed she would eventually give up, like everyone else had. She rolled past the rows of kennels, past the tails wagging so desperately they thumped against iron, until she reached the last shadowed corner. There he was, still pacing, still radiating rage like heat from a furnace. The sound of his growl rose as soon as he saw her. She stopped her chair a few feet away. This time, she didn't move closer. Instead, she set something gently on the concrete floor, a folded piece of cloth, her own scarf. It was worn soft with use, faintly smelling of lavender soap. Her hands trembled as she placed it down. She wasn't foolish enough to try slipping food through the bars yet. She had listened to the warnings, but she thought of all the dogs she had loved before, the ones who pressed their noses into her lap, who buried their faces into her blankets. Smell meant safety. Smell meant memory. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered, voice low so the other dog's barking didn't drown it out. "I just want you to know me." He didn't approach. He didn't stop pacing. But his nostrils flared, pulling in the faint trace of her scent. He snarled once, a warning, but his eyes lingered. The girl sat with him for nearly an hour, though she spoke only a few times. Mostly, she let the silence breathe between them. Occasionally, she closed her eyes and listened, to the rhythm of his paws on the concrete, to the scrape of his nails, to the restless circle of a creature who had forgotten peace. When she finally left, the scarf was still untouched, lying just outside his reach. The next day, she returned. This time, she found the scarf in the far corner of his kennel, crumpled but carried inside. Her heart squeezed so tightly it hurt. He had touched it, moved it, allowed a piece of her into his world. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. The girl began coming every afternoon, as though drawn by an invisible tether. She brought small offerings each time, sometimes just sitting quietly, other times humming songs she half remembered from childhood. She never pushed closer than the bars allowed. She never forced his attention. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. The growl that had once thundered the moment she appeared softened into a low rumble, and then, some days, into silence. His pacing slowed when she sat with him, as if her stillness seeped through the iron into his restless body. Once she caught him lying down while she was near, his massive head resting between his paws. It lasted only a minute before he jolted upright, snapping at shadows. But that minute was enough to leave her breathless. She began telling him stories. Not out loud at first, just in murmurs when the shelter was quiet. She told him about the hospital, about the months when she could feel nothing from the waist down, about the way people spoke around her, like she wasn't there. She spoke of the nights she had cried into her pillow, wishing she could run again, wishing she could feel the grass under her toes. The dog didn't answer, of course, but she imagined he listened. His ears flicked at her voice, his eyes followed her hands when she gestured in the air. And sometimes, on rare, fragile evenings, his head tilted just slightly, as though he were trying to understand. The volunteers noticed. They whispered when she passed. Some shook their heads, muttering that she was wasting her time. Others, softer-hearted, gave her space, as though sensing that what was happening in that corner of the shelter was too delicate to disturb. Then came the day she dared to bring her hand closer than ever before. Her palms were sweating as she gripped the wheel of her chair, stopping right before the bars. She took a slow breath, heart racing in her throat, and extended her hand, not through the metal, not within striking range, but near enough that her fingers brushed the cold iron. The dog growled low, throat vibrating. Every muscle in his body was tense, a bowstring drawn tight. She didn't move. Her eyes glistened with unspilled tears as she whispered, "It's okay. I'm not afraid of you." Her body shook, not from fear, but from the rawness of that truth. Because she wasn't. Not anymore. She knew rage when she saw it. She knew the way pain could twist love into something sharp and dangerous. She had lived in that shadow herself. The growl quivered, rose, and then faded. His nostrils flared, pulling in her scent again. Slowly, as though against his own will, he lowered his head until it hovered inches above her trembling fingers. The bars still separating them. He didn't touch her. Not yet. But his eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, the fire inside them softened into something almost unbearably human. She left the shelter that evening with her chest aching, her heart pounding like wings against a cage. She knew this was no victory, not yet. Trust was fragile, easily broken. But something had shifted. For the first time, the storm inside that kennel had given way to silence. And in that silence, a promise lived, unspoken but undeniable. They were no longer strangers. They were two wounded souls reaching, hesitantly, painfully, for one another. The girl returned the next day with her heart thundering, a fragile mix of hope and dread. The memory of his eyes, no longer blazing with fire but edged with sorrow, kept replaying in her mind. She could hardly sleep, and when she did, she dreamt of him pressing his scarred muzzle into her palm, of chains breaking and walls falling. But dreams, she knew, were dangerous. Reality was harder, crueler, often full of sharp edges that left wounds. When she wheeled into the shelter, the air smelled of bleach and wet fur. Dogs barked and howled in a chorus that rattled her bones, but she heard only the silence in the corner where he waited. The German shepherd was sitting this time, body taut but still. His eyes tracked her like a hawk's, and for a moment it felt like an invitation. She drew closer, slower than ever. Every inch of the floor between them felt like walking across glass. She stopped at the bars, heart galloping in her chest, and lifted her trembling hand again. This time, she pushed past the iron. The volunteers gasped from across the room. One began to rise, ready to intervene, but something in the girl's posture, the steadiness of her gaze, the fragile courage carved into her face, made them pause. Her hand hovered, suspended in the narrow space between them, and the shepherd's muscles rippled with tension. A low growl rolled from his chest, deeper than thunder, warning her back. But she didn't retreat. "It's okay," she whispered, voice soft as breath. "If you bite me, I'll understand. I just want you to know what it feels like to be touched without pain." Her hand trembled in the air, fingers open, no fists, no force. Vulnerability laid bare. And then, slowly, impossibly, he leaned forward. His nose brushed the edge of her palm, rough whiskers grazing her skin. A single exhale of hot breath fanned against her fingers. The world seemed to hold its breath. Her heart swelled so quickly it hurt. Tears blurred her vision, spilling over before she could stop them. She let out a shaky laugh, one that carried both wonder and grief. "Hi," she whispered, as though greeting an old friend. But the spell shattered in an instant. Something in the movement of her chair, a sudden scrape of wheels against concrete, broke the fragile thread. The dog jolted back, lips curling, a vicious snarl tearing from his throat. His teeth snapped so close to her skin that the air itself seemed to split. The volunteers shouted, rushing forward, but the girl yanked her hand back on instinct and shook her head violently. "No! Don't take him away, please!" The dog thrashed in his small space, fury exploding from every muscle, eyes wild again, as though the softness had never existed. He flung himself at the bars, body slamming so hard the metal rattled. The sound of his growl swallowed the room, drowning out her heartbeat. But even as fear clenched her stomach, even as her hands shook violently, she didn't wheel away. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the bars, inches from his snapping teeth, and whispered through the storm, "It's okay. I'm still here." Her voice cracked under the weight of her tears, but her words didn't waver. She let the chaos rage, let the fury burn itself out, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the dog's movements began to falter, his snarls turned into ragged breaths. His muscles quivered with exhaustion. Finally, he slumped against the wall of his kennel, chest heaving, eyes blazing but wet with something she almost dared to call grief. The volunteers murmured warnings, urging her to stop, to give up before she got hurt. But she turned her tear-streaked face toward them and said, with a strength she hadn't known she carried, "He's not broken. He's just afraid. And I know what that feels like." Her words hung in the air like a prayer no one wanted to answer. That night, she couldn't shake the echo of his teeth snapping so close to her hand. The terror lingered, coiled tight in her chest. But beneath it, stronger still, was the memory of his nose against her skin, the whisper of his breath, the brief, impossible proof that trust had flickered alive, if only for a heartbeat. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her legs useless beneath the sheets. A bitter thought crept in, maybe they're right. Maybe he'll never change. Maybe I'm chasing something that will only hurt me. But then she remembered his eyes in that single, fragile moment. How the fire had dimmed. How sorrow had shimmered there like a reflection of her own soul. And she knew she couldn't walk away. Not yet, because somewhere inside that storm of fur and scars was a creature who longed to be free. And she, more than anyone, knew what it meant to live behind bars. So she made herself a promise, whispering it into the silence of her room. "No matter how long it takes, I'll be your friend. Even if you fight me, even if you hate me, I'll be here." And with that vow, fragile yet unbreakable, she closed her eyes. Somewhere across town, in a darkened kennel, the shepherd lay restless, her scarf still crumpled in the corner, her scent keeping vigil with him through the night. The days blurred into a rhythm of patience and heartbreak. Each morning, she wheeled into the shelter with her scarf tied around her neck, and each morning she parked herself before his kennel, waiting. She never demanded, never pushed. Sometimes she simply sat there in silence, whispering stories about her life, about the accident that had stolen her legs, about the silence that followed when her old friends drifted away. The dog, still nameless to her, because naming felt too much like claiming, watched her with an intensity that both unsettled and anchored her. Some days, he would press closer to the bars, chest heaving, ears forward, nostrils flaring as if searching her scent. Other days, he retreated into the shadows, curling into himself, refusing even to look at her. Healing, she realized, was not a straight path but a winding, broken road full of cliffs and storms. One afternoon, when the rain hammered the shelter roof like fists, she brought something new. A bowl, scuffed and faded, the leather soft from use. She had dug it out of a box at home, one she hadn't touched since her accident. It was her brother's once, the one who had spent years tossing it into her hands before she learned to catch with ease. She had cried when she found it again, but she brought it anyway. She rolled the bowl gently into his kennel, letting it wobble across the concrete until it stopped near his paws. For a long moment, nothing. His golden brown eyes flicked toward it, then away. He growled softly, unsure, as though the object itself carried some hidden threat. But slowly, hesitantly, he extended one paw, tapping it as if testing the earth for danger. The ball rolled a few inches. Something flickered across his face, confusion, maybe curiosity, and then, almost imperceptibly, his tail twitched. Her breath caught. "That's it," she whispered, voice trembling with awe. "It's just a ball. No one's going to hurt you. You can play." He nosed it forward, awkward, unsure. The ball clattered against the kennel wall. His tail twitched again, stronger this time, betraying a piece of joy he didn't seem to know how to hold. Tears blurred her sight as laughter spilled out of her chest, the sound surprising even her. For a moment, the shelter was filled with something other than barking and despair. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to hush, letting the fragile miracle inside sing louder. But storms are not easily silenced. The next week, news spread through the shelter that the county intended to put down several aggressive dogs to make space. His name, if one could call the label on his kennel a name, was near the top of the list. Her blood turned to ice when she overheard the hushed conversation between staff. They didn't mean to let her hear, but the words carried anyway. That shepherd, Too dangerous. No one's gonna take him. We don't have the resources. She wheeled back from the corner, heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear. Her hands shook on the rims of her chair, but her voice rose with a strength that startled even her. No, you can't. He's not dangerous. He's scared, but he's getting better. I've seen it. The staff exchanged weary looks, the kind that spoke of years of hard decisions, of too many lost animals and too few homes. Sweetheart, one said gently, I know you care, but caring doesn't always change reality. Her throat burned. She wanted to scream that they were wrong. That reality was something you fought for, not something you surrendered to. Instead, she wheeled herself back to his kennel, pressing both palms flat against the bars. Inside, he stirred as though sensing the storm raging inside her. Their eyes met, hers swimming with tears, his dark and searching. They're wrong, she whispered fiercely, voice breaking. You hear me? They're wrong. I'm not letting them take you. For the first time, he stepped closer on his own. No coaxing, no treats, no scarf or ball, just instinct. He pressed his scarred muzzle against the bars, and she pressed her forehead against the cool metal on the other side. And in that quiet, fragile moment, the storm outside roared louder than ever, thunder cracking like a warning, lightning spilling light into the room. But neither of them moved. It was as if the world was daring them to give up. And together, without words, they refused. That night, she dreamed of running, not wheeling, not dragging her legs, but running free beside him in a field lit by golden sun. His fur brushed against her arm, his bark rang like laughter, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, her chest aching with longing. But she also woke with a decision carved deep into her heart. She would fight for him, no matter what it cost. Because storms might rage, chains might rattle, and the world might call him dangerous. But she had seen his heart flicker to life. She had felt the moment his fear loosened, just enough to let hope breathe. And once you've touched hope, you can't let it die. The morning she returned, the shelter felt different. The air was heavy, tense, as though the walls themselves knew what was coming. A whiteboard near the front desk bore the names of those scheduled for evaluation. Her eyes darted across the list, stomach twisting when she saw the word, Shepherd, written in marker, cold and final. Her hands gripped her wheelchair so tightly the rubber on the rims squeaked. For a moment, the world tilted, just the way it had that night when her car spun across wet asphalt, shattering her legs and her life in one cruel sweep. But she forced her breath steady, forced herself back into the present. This wasn't about her pain anymore. This was about his life. She rolled down the corridor, the barking of other dogs swelling around her, but she heard none of it. Only the echo of her wheels on concrete, only the hollow drum of her heartbeat. And then she reached his kennel. He was pacing, restless, his body tense as if he sensed the unease. The second he saw her, his eyes fixed on hers, and something in his body stilled. It was as though he knew she had come not as a visitor today, but as something else entirely. I won't let them take you, she whispered, voice hoarse. Not like this. Not without knowing love. Her trembling hands reached into her bag, pulling out a leash. Bright red, frayed at the edges, one she had once used with her childhood dog before her accident. She had carried it for years like a relic of a life she thought was gone. Today, it would mean something new. The staff had always warned her, don't go in. He'll lash out, he'll bite. But rules crumble when weighed against the edge of a life. Her fingers found the latch on the kennel. For a moment, the world held its breath. The door creaked open. He froze. Muscles coiled tight, eyes flicking from her hands to the open gap to the world beyond. For a heartbeat, fear flared in his gaze. Fear of the unknown, fear of humans, fear of betrayal once again. Then she spoke, voice soft, breaking with conviction. You're not alone anymore. Not ever again. Her hand trembled as she extended the leash. He growled low, the sound rumbling like thunder in his chest. Every instinct screamed at her to pull back, to slam the door shut. But she stayed. She let him see the truth in her trembling. She was just as broken, just as scarred, just as desperate to believe in a second chance. Minutes passed. Rain tapped against the shelter's tin roof. Her breath fogged in the cool air. And then, slowly, agonizingly, He stepped forward, one paw then another. His nose brushed her hand, hot breath ghosting over her skin. Her chest shattered open in relief as she clipped the leash to his collar. The sound of the clasp clicking shut was small, almost fragile, but it felt louder than the storm itself. The staff rushed forward, panic rising. "What are you doing? He's dangerous." But they froze at the sight before them. They're aggressive. Shepherd stood still, his broad head lowered beside her hand, the leash slack between them. His tail, so long stiff and curled in distrust, hung low, swaying with the faintest motion. He looked not like a monster, but like a soldier waiting for command, ready to trust the one person who had seen him beyond the scars. She raised her chin, tears streaking her cheeks. "He's mine," she said, voice firm. "And I'm not leaving without him." The staff argued, their voices sharp, their fear real. But in her eyes, there was no room left for surrender. She wheeled him forward, the red leash trailing between them like a lifeline stitched by fate itself. When the shelter doors swung open, daylight spilled in, pale and uncertain. He hesitated at the threshold, nails clicking against the concrete, ears twitching at the wide, terrifying world outside. Her hand moved instinctively, resting gently against his fur. "It's freedom," she whispered. "It's scary. But it's ours." Together, they stepped into the light. For the first time in years, he didn't look back. And for the first time in years, neither did she. The day they walked, or rather, rolled, out of the shelter was not the end of their struggle. It was the beginning. The German shepherd did not suddenly become tame, nor did the girl suddenly feel whole again. Trust was not won in a single moment. It had to be built brick by fragile brick, day by patient day. At first, he startled at every sound. The slamming of a car door, the rattle of a bicycle, the bark of a neighbor's dog. His hackles rose, and his body braced for battle, a soldier who had never known peace. She understood that instinct. In her own way, she braced too, against pitying glances in grocery store aisles, against the frustration of not reaching the top shelf, against the quiet moments in the night when she remembered what it was like to run. But together, something began to shift. On their first night home, he would not enter her bedroom. He lingered in the doorway, pacing, torn between fear and yearning. She left the door wide open, speaking softly to him until her eyes grew heavy. When she awoke at dawn, he was curled at the foot of her bed, as if he had been watching over her all night. Weeks passed, and he learned the rhythm of her wheels against hardwood floors, the sound of her voice calling him gently when storms rolled in. She learned, too, the language of his ears, the meaning in the tilt of his head, the subtle way his body leaned against hers when he sensed her despair. It was not easy. There were setbacks. One afternoon, a man approached too quickly on the sidewalk, and the shepherd lunged, barking with a ferocity that froze the man mid-step. She held the leash tight, her heart hammering. But instead of fear, she spoke his name. "It's okay," she whispered, again and again, until his growls softened, until his eyes flicked back to hers, grounding himself in her calm. That night, she cried, not from fear, but from gratitude. For the first time in years, she did not feel weak or vulnerable walking down a street. She felt protected, safe, seen. The shepherd, once labeled aggressive, had become her shield. And she, once labeled broken, had become his anchor. As seasons turned, so did their bond. Autumn leaves painted the sidewalks gold, and she laughed as he pounced into piles, sending them scattering like confetti. Winter came, snow muffling the world, and he trotted at her side, nose dusted white, his body a wall of warmth against the chill. In spring, she wheeled into the park, watching children reach out timidly to pet him. To her amazement, he allowed it, lowering his head gently so their small hands could brush his fur. "It's not scary at all," one child said, giggling. "No," she whispered, a lump in her throat. "There never was." The town began to notice them, the girl in the wheelchair and the shepherd at her side, moving as one. Some whispered in awe, others in disbelief. Shelter staff who had once feared him came to see him again, astonished at his transformation. "He's a different dog," they said. But she knew the truth. He was not different. He had always been this dog, loyal, tender, brave. He had only needed someone to believe it. And so had she. Months later, she returned to the shelter, Not as a visitor, not as a girl desperate to save a single life, but as a volunteer. Her shepherd trotted proudly beside her, wearing a bright red harness that read service dog, his chest puffed out, tail swaying with quiet confidence. The same kennels lined the hall, filled with frightened eyes and trembling paws. She wheeled closer to a cage, speaking softly to a cowering puppy. She knew that fear. She had lived it. When the staff introduced her to new volunteers, they pointed and smiled. "This is the girl who saved the shepherd," they said. But she shook her head, resting her hand gently on his fur. "No," she replied softly. "He saved me." That night, as they returned home, the two of them sat together by the window. Rain pattered against the glass, the same way it had the day she first clipped the leash to his collar. He lay with his head across her lap, eyes half closed, utterly at peace. She stroked the scarred ridge of his ear, her voice barely a whisper. "They said you were too broken to be saved. They said I'd never walk, never live fully again. But maybe broken things aren't meant to be thrown away. Maybe they're meant to find each other, to build something new." His tail thumped once, steady and sure as if to agree. Outside the storm raged, but inside there was only quiet. Two souls, scarred yet whole. Two hearts, once abandoned, now found. Not perfect, not easy, but alive. Together, and sometimes that is all the miracle the world needs.